my name's Hailey, and today I'm going to be talking about some books that you probably have never heard of. Obviously, you guys probably have heard of at least a couple of the books on this list, especially if you watch my videos, because they are books that I have talked about before. But my point is, these are basically underrated books, or books that I don't think are talked about enough. They fly under the radar, but I think that they deserve a lot more attention than they are getting. I have books from pretty much every single genre. There's historical fiction on here, fantasy, contemporary, there's a little bit of everything. But if you're looking for something that you've never seen before and you haven't thought of reading, a sort of hidden gem in the YA universe, then this is the video for you. I don't know why I said that like that, but let's just get into the list. I have divided these books by genre for you guys, so if you're looking for an underrated book in a particular genre, I will have a timestamp listed in the description below. So to start off, historical fiction, my first recommendation is Prisoner of Night and Fog by Anne Blankman. I read this book a long time ago. I'm talking like when I first started BookTube. That's when it first came out, and it is something that I was kind of skeptical about going into it because it takes a very prevalent historical figure that I feel like a lot of authors would be too intimidated to tackle, and it builds a story around him, and that character is Hitler. I feel like that was such a dramatic way to say that, but this book follows Hitler's niece. It is a World War II historical fiction, obviously, and it's all about her realizing that he is not who she thought he was, and that her father has died and he might actually have a hand in that, and that not everything is as it seems. So she ends up actually teaming up with a Jewish reporter, and a relationship develops between the two of them as they are trying to uncover the truth about everything that's happening. It's high stakes, it's intense, and it also has great characters, great development throughout the whole duology. I don't really see anyone else talking about this book, but if you are into historical fiction at all, particularly World War II, I definitely encourage you to give this one a try. I don't think that you'll regret it. Actually, all of my historical fiction recommendations here are World War II because, one, there is a lot of it out there, and two, it is something that I really like to read. But next is Wolf by Ryan Graudin. You're probably thinking, I've definitely heard of this book before, but I feel like a big reason why you might be thinking that is because since I read it, I have talked about it a lot. I included it in a recent reading vlog, and it just blew me away, honestly. It's one of the first books in a while that I've given 5 out of 5 stars because I thought it was that good. This is a bit different because it's an alternate history story, and it's what if the Axis powers won World War II. So Hitler is actually the leader, and obviously there's going to be a lot of negative fallout from that. There's a lot of unique elements to this story, so I encourage you to not be turned off by that. Just give it a go. There is skin shifting, which I wasn't really sure why, but it's because the main character is a former death camp prisoner, and she is used for human experimentation, and it ends up leaving her with the side effect of being able to skin shift. She ends up using that in order to enter into this motorcycle race that they have every year, and it's across the continents. Where do they go? They start in Germania, which is formerly Berlin, and they race all the way to Tokyo. I think that was the end goal. I'm sorry if I'm wrong about that, but I'm pretty sure that's where they end up going. But whoever gets there and wins the race, they end up getting to meet Hitler. And the main character is going to use her skin shifting power to look like one of the former winners, so then she can enter into this race and at the end meet Hitler and kill him. Very intense, the setup for a lot, and it is once again a very high stakes story. I do think that if you liked this one or Prisoner of Night and Fog, I think you would like both of them. But I love the risks that both of those stories take, actually. I think they're just so different, and that's what I love about them. I thought this was very well-rounded, super good, highly recommended. And lastly, for historical fiction is The Girl in the Blue Coat by Monica Hesse. I picked this one up on a whim because it is set in Amsterdam during World War II, and I have Dutch heritage, so I wanted to read more about that environment because I know I've heard a lot of stories from my relatives of what life was like then, but reading this book exposed me to a little bit more of that. So I do have a personal connection to the story, but I also think that it delved into what was going on during the war in Nazi-occupied Holland, and let me know about a lot of things, in particular the train station that was used as a major hub for a lot of terrible things, and And the setup for the story is that the main character has been running errands for people, and she goes and one of her neighbors asks her to try and find the Jewish girl that she was hiding because she has gone missing. So she sets off on a journey trying to locate her, which is obviously a risky mission, and you follow her doing that and uncovering a lot of things. So it's kind of a mystery story, and it's also written by a journalist, and I think that really came through in the telling of it. Next, I have one dystopian, and that is Ink by Alice Broadway. I got vibes of a lot of dystopians that I loved from this story, but not in a negative way. It reminded me of the best parts of them. The Giver in particular, Untitled, and I think Untitled came into it because it has to do with bodies in a way. Basically, in this world, everything you've ever done is tattooed on your body, and then when you die, your skin is turned into a book for your like not actually your skin, but the tattoos are transferred to a book, and your family can go and read the story of your life and remember you. But the main character's father dies, and it's discovered that he won't get to do that because he has this mark that makes sure that he won't be able to be turned into a book, and she's like, why does he have this mark? So it becomes kind of a mystery story once again, but you're learning more about the society. I thought that the tattoo aspect was really interesting, and it was something that I'd actually thought of once, not of writing my own book, but I was like, that would be a cool idea for a book, and here it is. If you're looking for a new dystopian that takes some typical dystopian conventions and twists them in its own way, you might like this book. I just went and put on lipstick because I realized I took it off to have a snack in between filming videos, and I never put it back on, so moving on. Now I have a couple of retellings, the first one being Pride by Ibi Zoboi. This is a Pride and Prejudice retelling, but it is set in Brooklyn, and it is a commentary on the gentrification of Brooklyn, and I think it uses the original story in such an interesting way. It says on it that it's a Pride and Prejudice remix, and honestly, that is the perfect way to describe it. It features an Afro-Latino main character, and the wealthy Darcy family ends up moving in across the street, and obviously that's where you get the Pride and Prejudice from. There are also excerpts of poetry throughout, and it's just really good, and I loved how it twisted that original story and took it to a modern setting and used it to make social commentary that is important to think about. And the other retelling I have is Entwined by Heather Dixon. This is a retelling of the 12 Dancing Princesses fairy tale, and that's a fairy tale that I've never actually read, but this was such a fun story. So obviously there are 12 siblings, which I loved the fact that there were 12 sisters, and they feel trapped in their house, so they end up escaping to this forest at night through their bedroom where they dance, and there's this keeper there, but he takes things and it ends up obviously being a problem. I'm not exactly sure how much it relates to the original fairy tale since I haven't read it, and I wasn't really familiar with it at all before reading this, but it was a really fun, fantastical story that has a forest setting, which was nice. Finally, I have the two biggest piles here, which is fantasy and contemporary. So starting off with the fantasies that I have, The Crown's Game by Evelyn Skye. This is set in Russia, and that setting is part of the reason why I loved it so much, but it features two characters in a magical competition to try and be the Tsar's apprentice. And Tsar? Why did I say Tsar? Tsar's apprentice. I don't know what just happened there. They each have a companion who is helping them to train, and the magic system was super cool. There would be this like just giant demonstration, so I just had so much fun imagining it, and I think it was very well built up. I flew through this book a lot quicker than I was expecting. I went into it with really no expectations, not knowing what it was going to be like, and I was super pleasantly surprised. Next is The Queen of Blood by Sarah Beth Durst. This is actually an adult fantasy, but I still wanted to include it because I think it is a great one. It has a really cool world. There are these spirits, and there's trees, and like it's just a natural world, which I think is a lot of fun to read about. That was one of my favorite parts of it, was escaping into that world. It follows a world where the queen is the only one who is able to protect humankind from these vicious spirits, and because that is such a risky job, the queen trains an heir, and that is the character that you get to follow. Actually, I think you get to follow two characters. I haven't read in a long time, but I want to get back into this series. I'm surprised more people don't talk about it because it just is that kind of quintessential epic fantasy, and it's done very well. Next is The Valiant by Lesley Livingston. This mixes a little bit of historical fiction with a little bit of fantasy, and that for me is a great combo. This is about female gladiators. The main character, Fallon, her sister was this fierce warrior, and she ended up getting killed in battle when Fallon was very young. So Fallon is finally old enough to take her own and take up the position that her sister left behind. She wants to live up to her name. Fallon is also a princess, by the way, but their armies have been fighting against Caesar for a long time, and before she is actually able to join in that fight, she ends up getting recruited by this mysterious elite school that is training women to be warriors. So there are a lot of twists and turns in this story, and the female gladiator aspect is one of my favorite things about it. So if you like gladiators and you like ancient Rome and all that stuff, then definitely try this out. And the final fantasy is definitely a lower fantasy, and by that I mean that it doesn't really have a magic system or that many fantastical elements, but it is still categorized as a fantasy because it's kind of like a historical-ish world, but it is a fantasy world because it's not real world. Basically, it's just, yeah. It's a good book nonetheless, and that is Long May She Reign by Rhiannon Thomas. This is a fantasy standalone, which is a cool element to it, but it's a fictional kingdom is what I was trying to say. Fictional is what I was trying, that word just wouldn't come to me. The main character of this book is 23rd or something in line for the throne, so obviously she's never expecting for it to actually go to her, but at this dinner, all of the people before her are poisoned and end up dying, and she ends up on the throne. And there's a murder mystery, obviously, to try and figure out who did that. Well, she's also trying to take up the throne and gain the respect of people who don't respect her at all because they were never expecting her to come into power, and she's trying to combat all of that. There's also a scientific element to it. She's really into science, so she puts that into trying to solve this mystery, and there was also anxiety rep, I believe I remember. I just had a lot of fun reading this book, and once again, it's one that surprised me. And finally, for the biggest pile, contemporaries. First is Your Welcome Universe by Whitney Gardner. This book has a few unique elements. It features representation for the deaf and hard of hearing community, which I loved. That was one of my favorite things about it. And the second thing is graffiti. Graffiti is a main part of the plot line. The main character is super into it and describes it as an art form, so you get to learn more about the art behind that, and there are also illustrations in it, which was a cool element that definitely added to my reading experience. The main character has gone to a school for the deaf and hard of hearing, but then she ends up getting in trouble and is kicked out of that school and has to go to a school with hearing people. This obviously is going to be a huge adjustment for her, and she's really worried about it, and it's about that journey that she's going on. I loved the artistic element to it. I loved the representation for deaf culture. I definitely recommend that you check it out. Next is Far From the Tree by Robin Benway. This is a story, it's kind of a found family, but not really. Essentially, all three of these siblings were adopted out, but they don't know of each other. But then they finally come to meet and try to find their adopted birth mother. All of them are coming from different backgrounds. The one thought that she was an only child, but then finds out that she's a middle child, and the one was never even actually adopted. He has been stuck in the foster care system, and you get to see how their upbringing affects them and how they end up coming together later in life. It's a really emotional story, and I think that it's one of my favorite books about family because it's a different sort of family, but I think that the sibling bond was still powerful even though it came to be later in life. I don't think I've ever read a book where adoption was a main topic of it like this before, and I think it did a great job of exploring that and exploring the different backgrounds and a sort of nature versus nurture thing, and also having you care for these siblings and the family unit that they end up forming together. Next is Cure for the Common Universe by Christian McKay Heidicker. I recommended this book all the time when I worked at the bookstore because there would be a lot of times where kids would come in looking for books for a book report and they weren't really into reading and they just had to read something, and I found that a lot of kids were really into video games, so I was like, maybe you'll like this one, and 9 times out of 10 this is the book that they went home with. Basically, I'm saying that because if you're into video games and you're trying to get into reading, you might want to try this book. I also say that because the whole premise of it is that the main character character finally gets a date with this real life girl and he's so excited, but on that day he is sent to video game rehab, and that's like a real thing. I don't know if that's actually a real thing that exists in real life, but it was something that was super cool to read about, how that whole rehabilitation facility worked, and it was a fun and quirky story that kept me engaged. Next, I have a couple of books by the same author. The one I feel like you've probably heard of because I talk about it quite a bit, but the other one I enjoyed pretty much as equally as the first one, but I don't think I talk about it as much. But that author is Jessica Brody. So here we have the first one I was talking about that I talk about quite a bit is The Chaos of Standing Still. This is told on one day where they are stuck in an airport and it's New Year's Eve, and the main character is grieving the loss of her best friend. She has this text that she has left on unread for a year now because it's the anniversary of her death. She's never read it, and then she ends up running into this guy at the airport and they end up switching phones, so obviously she's panicked, but it's just those 24 hours, and it was a very powerful story for such a short period of time. The other book is also pretty powerful. It is a longer period of time, but that is The Geography of Lost Things. This was pretty unexpected for me. It's a road trip story, and the main character, her family isn't doing so well in terms of money, and her father, who was estranged, has just died, so she's trying to figure out how to grieve him when she never actually had a relationship with him. And he left behind his prized possession, his car. So she knows that the car is worth a lot of money, so she's like, I finally found someone to sell it, but he's across the state of California, so she has to drive it there, but she can't drive stick. So the only person that can help her is her ex-boyfriend because he drives stick. So it's just a road trip with her ex-boyfriend where she's also dealing with grief. There are so many emotions coming to the forefront. She also has an obsession with personality quizzes, which was cool. And then the other element is that across their trip, they try and trade up for things. Instead of spending money, they try and they start with the hair elastic and then trade up to this and trade up to that and use Craigslist to do that. I'd never heard of that concept before, so it was really interesting to watch that unfold over the course of this book. Both of these are going to have you a little bit emotional, but they're also going to be fun along the way. Next is A Million Junes by Emily Henry. This is sort of like Romeo and Juliet, and I say that because the two characters in this book are from feuding families, and they don't know why their families are feuding. They've never understood this rivalry, and they're trying to uncover that over the course of this novel. It's set in the Michigan wilderness, and there's a kind of magical element to it as well, so it is kind of ish a magical realism, but it's mysterious and it has this long family bloodline that you're following and learning about why they've been fighting alongside the characters, and to me that kind of just made me think Romeo and Juliet, and I loved it. It's also pretty dark and mysterious, so if you're into that, you would like this. And my final recommendation is once again from Ibi Zoboi, and that is American Street. American Street is once again a story that features some social commentary. I think that's what Ibi Zoboi excels at, is writing stories that you don't really realize that they're making you think until you're like, oh, I'm thinking about things. That sounded so stupid, but they're stories that you can apply to real life events that are very prevalent nowadays. This one in particular features a Haitian immigrant. She's immigrating, but when they finally get to Detroit, their end destination, her mother is detained by customs, so she ends up having to navigate this entire new world all on her own with cousins that she's never met before. And this talks a lot about how these immigrants often end up being placed in these communities that aren't the greatest, and they're on the fringes of society, and they're not given the same opportunities as other people. So it comments on that a lot and definitely makes you think, goes different ways than you're expecting. This once again sort of has a magical element, and that was a cool thing that added to my experience of reading it. So those are all of my underrated recommendations, books that I think you've never heard of. I hope that at least one of these books on this list you hadn't heard of before. Then I will feel pretty accomplished, but I'm sure a lot of you out there have heard of most of these, but maybe there was just that one. If you have a book that you think is underrated and no one's ever heard of that you love, please comment it down below. I would love to go through and see if there's any that I maybe missed on my list. But thank you guys so much for watching today's video. I hope you are staying safe and healthy, and I will see you guys in the next one very soon. Bye!